Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so thrilled that you've chosen to join us today for the virtual launch celebration for Mark Miller's 11th and latest book, Culture Rules. My name is Becky Robinson, and I want to let you know about a few technical considerations for today's event. As you can see, we do have cameras available. If yours is active, we would encourage you to turn it on. We would love to see your face and have you celebrate with us on this important day. So please feel free to use your camera. We would ask that you remain muted on your microphone unless you are called on to speak so that we can maintain the technical integrity of the event so that others can enjoy this recording later. And so thank you in advance for that. Later on in today's event, we are going to give you a chance to talk to Mark, and Harris, who is our host today, who you'll meet in a moment, will be calling on you. At that point, we're going to ask you to use the hand raise function. So if you want to take a moment to get familiar with the Zoom panel, you can use that hand raise function, or you can use the chat to let us know that you would like a chance to speak with Mark. So I'm ready almost to turn things over to Mark and Harris for this amazing celebration. But before I do, one of the things that Harris asked before the call is, who are these people who are coming to Mark Miller's virtual launch party? And so we would love to have you tell us in the chat, what is your connection to Mark Miller and today's event? You might be a fan, you might be connected through the Chick-fil-A family, you might be one of our culture champions. It may be that you found out about this event randomly through social media, or maybe you're one of Mark's longtime friends like Bob Tiede. We'd love to see in the chat how you happened to land here. And before I turn things over to Harris and Mark, I'm just going to take a brief moment. I bet you all already know Mark. You may not need me to introduce him, but for those of you who might be brand new to Mark, Mark is a corporate employee of Chick-fil-A for over 43 years. He started as one of the first corporate employees. He is now the vice president of high performance leadership. He's the author of 11 books, including the latest one, Culture Rules. And he's a dad, a granddad, a great friend and leader. And Mark, it's such a thrill to support you and celebrate with you today.
Well, thank you, Becky. For those that don't know, Becky and her team have helped support many of the books that we've launched over the years, and I'm very thankful for your partnership. It's great to see all of you today. In this format, I can actually go to the gallery mode and scroll from page to page and see many of you, those who've chosen to turn on your cameras. So it is great to see your smiling faces today. It's a big day. You know, we're launching Culture Rules, and I'm excited, and I appreciate you willing to share this hour with us. To make this time as fruitful and productive as possible, I invited my friend Harris III. Now, if you don't know Harris, you should. Harris is a storyteller, a best-selling author. He's actually the best host slash MC I've encountered in my life. And so I've hired him several times to do events for Chick-fil-A. And I said, if we're going to celebrate today, we're going to bring out the big guns. I want to bring out Harris to help us lead and guide this conversation. Plus, it gives me an excuse to spend some time with Harris. So Harris, thank you for joining us. You know, I'm your biggest fan and just delighted that you would join us today.
Oh man, it's an honor to be here and just kind of celebrate this big day for you. I cracked open my copy of the book this morning, Cultural Rules. I actually remember sitting backstage at Next. Gosh, must have been 3-4 years ago when you started dreaming about this book and the subject matter and us having conversations about it. So I've been looking forward to this day for a long time, and it's cool to see a little small glimpse into your legacy by all the different leaders represented across our screens today. Congratulations, my friend.
Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, well, I want to jump in. Again, we want to hear questions from you throughout the day or throughout this time together at least. And so as you have questions that pop up for Mark, drop those into the chat. Later, we'll have a chance to even hear from some of you as well. But really want to know where your head's at as we engage with the content of this book. This is for you guys. Mark showed up going, hey, whatever they want to know, whatever questions they have, how can we most serve them based on the content of this book? Mark, while they're thinking through things and while we're kind of jumping in, I'd love just to start with a little bit of the story behind the book. I know a lot of these are longtime friends of yours, but when it comes to this particular book and your journey at Chick-fil-A. You've been at Chick-fil-A for a long time, almost 45 years now, which is amazing.
I was going to
since you're
say,
only
I was going to
55
say
years old.
100 years. I was going to say I've been there 100 years, which makes it even more amazing since I'm only 55 years old. You're right.
Yeah. So you started at 10, right?
Right. As a small child, I began selling chicken.
Let's lay the foundation for a conversation around culture with a little bit of your Chick-fil-A story. Catch us up to speed. Share a short version of your story with us.
Okay. Yes. I started as a team member about 45 years ago in one of the local restaurants. Some of you have heard my story. I was awful in the restaurant, and I made a strategic career decision. This is not advice or counsel, but I quit because I felt like it'd be better to quit than to be fired and then have to explain on my resume why I got fired from Chick-fil-A. I was just awful in the restaurant. I just was. So I went and got another job. 6 months later, I got laid off, and I said, I need a job. And I thought, shoot, I can't do what they do in the restaurant, but those seem like nice people. So I think I'll get a job at the corporate headquarters, which of course makes no sense at any level. But again, the mind of a child. And so I went to the corporate headquarters, and I walked in and I told the receptionist, I want a job working in your warehouse. And so she told me to have a seat. And just a few minutes later, Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, came out, took me into his office to conduct the interview. Well, you're probably thinking, well, that makes no sense. Well, it didn't even make sense to me as a kid. Why is the CEO and founder of this company interviewing me to work in the warehouse? Well, I found out that I was interviewing to be the 16th corporate employee. And if you lead an organization with 15 or 16 employees, the head guy or the head gal is probably doing those interviews. And so just to pick up the pace here, I tell people it was a combination of God's grace and lack of discernment on Truett's part that he gave me that job in the warehouse. And that was 43 plus years ago. And I've had trouble holding down a job ever since. Here on staff, I've worked all over the business. I've had the privilege to start several things. I don't think it was really about my talent or skill set. It was let the kid do it, and I would do anything. So I started our quality and customer satisfaction group, and I started our corporate communications group, and also worked a while in field operations and led the training group. And again, have had real trouble holding down a job. The reason I think I'm here today is about 25 years ago, I began to focus the lion's share of my energy and effort on helping our leaders and leaders around the world grow their leadership capacity. And that's taken many forms over the last quarter of a century. And we try to pick a project that represents an emerging need, problem, challenge, or opportunities that we see on the horizon, that if we could get a half a step ahead of something, that'd be great. Now, we're not always that good. Sometimes we have to think about and create and publish about current real-time challenges. But we're looking at those on the horizon type issues. And sometimes we'll be so bold, we'll actually try to look over the horizon and say, wouldn't it be good if leaders could learn to do X, Y, Z better? Mm-hmm. So, long way around, the topic of culture showed up on our radar several years ago. We were picking up some weak signals. We heard more and more leaders talking about culture and asking us questions about culture. And we said, well, the more we thought about it, it didn't really surprise us, because as an organization grows in volume, scale, complexity, culture becomes more challenging and more difficult. So we embarked on this project several years ago. How can we help leaders strengthen their culture? Now, just a caveat, we had no idea that COVID was coming and what COVID would do to the world. I think it makes the timing of this book even more appropriate, because what I believe is that COVID exposed more than it created. It exposed the strengths in some cultures. Some organizations thrived during that season, and other organizations, they didn't do so well. It exposed the pressure, exposed the cracks. And then, of course, most of us are a mix. It probably highlighted some strengths of our culture, and it probably exposed some weaknesses in our culture. So I'm very thankful. My team is very thankful that this book is landing now as we emerge from COVID.
Yeah. The timing is amazing. And it's interesting because, I've heard stories of all the other amazing brands that seem to be elevated in the world as companies with the most amazing culture. And yet many of them have come to you and your team over the years at Chick-fil-A going, you guys understand something that we don't. There's just something special about the culture here. Why is it that so many companies are coming to Chick-fil-A for culture? What is it that you guys have cracked the code on? Is there some sort of cheat code? And if so, is that what the book is about?
No, well, it's interesting. So, okay, two thoughts flash into my mind when you ask that question. But the best organizations are always learning organizations. And so the people who come talk to us are generally the strong brands. Oh, by the way, and we do the same thing. When we're trying to learn about something, we go talk to the strong brands. And so it's not surprising that people come to me, because the best companies are always looking for best practices, regardless of the topic of the day. As far as the book, and is it the cheat code? Maybe, but I just had an interview earlier this morning, and I was trying to explain to someone, this book is not about Chick-fil-A. This book validates what I've experienced for the last 40 years. When we embark on a project like this, one of my greatest fears is that I would just write about and document my own personal bias. And I never want to do that. So when we start on a project like this, we're trying to say what is universally true about the topic, and then we will write about it. Often that requires some translation so that whatever is universally true is approachable and applicable, and then we write about it. And so we went through that same process on culture, even though I feel very fortunate, thankful, and blessed to have been part of the Chick-fil-A culture. We did all that work and finished it and said, this is how you build a thriving, vibrant, dynamic, high-performance culture. Oh, and that is what we've done at Chick-fil-A. So we validated our real-world experience. One more word about that, because some people really get excited about what I'm about to share. When I say we want to try to figure out what is universally true here, it varies from project to project. But on this book, we ended up surveying or interviewing more than 6,000 people in 10 countries, trying to figure out what is universally true about culture. And that became the cornerstone. That research became the cornerstone for what we published in the book.
Yeah. This is one of the things I was going to comment on. One, this is your 11th book. Writing one book is no joke. Writing 11 of them means you've got a lot of wisdom to share, a lot of experience. I think it goes back to starting at 10 years old, maybe at Chick-fil-A.
Well, I think as much as anything, it's about learning and then sharing what I'm learning. And so 5 years ago, I couldn't have written this book, but the last 5 years, we've learned a lot. And the books I'm working on now, I couldn't have written them a decade ago. So I think it's a byproduct of that lifelong learning.
Yeah. And I love that you took that lifelong learning, that experience, didn't just go out and write a book based on that experience, but then went and did all of that research with so many people. Now that you've mentioned that, what did you learn? What was the biggest takeaway from the research that surprised you?
We learned a lot, as you might imagine, reams and reams and hundreds of pages of PowerPoint slides of data and findings. So let me give you a couple that were the most surprising. Well, the first one was not surprising, but let me affirm the folks on this call. I'm guessing that at least 7 out of 10 of you think culture is really important. And I say that with some confidence because as we looked at the world, 72% of US leaders and 67% of global leaders say culture is the most powerful tool at their disposal. It's the most powerful tool at their disposal to drive performance. 7 out of 10 leaders already agree. Now, that informed a little bit of what we did in the book because we didn't spend much time trying to convince people. We figure 7 out of 10 people already believe it. Now, we did put in some obligatory stats because the jury is in. There is data out there. Strong cultures outperform all other cultures. So we didn't ignore the data, but 7 out of 10 agree. So that was not the flash of insight. But we asked those same leaders to rank their priorities. And creating and maintaining culture came in number 12. for U.S. leaders. Now that was troubling, problematic, and I actually think it explains why so many organizations have unhealthy cultures. Leaders are not working on their cultures. Now, one more stat, because we could go down this rabbit hole and there's more value we can add here. Generally speaking, and you can decide how nice you want to say this or how harsh you want to be. Generally speaking, global leaders are out of touch. Now, I chose that as kind of the middle language because you could make that sound better and you could make that sound worse. Let me give you one simple example, because these are questions about culture. So one example, we asked leaders, senior leaders, if you have a great place to work. And then we asked frontline associates if you have a great place to work. There was a 40-point gap.
Wow.
Could be another reason leaders aren't working on culture is they don't think they've got a problem. But their frontline people say, yep, it's not near as good to work around here as you think it is. So all of that led us to the path of how can we simplify all of these findings without becoming simplistic. We know there's a line out there, and when you cross it, your work is useless or worse. It's a waste of human energy and time and capital. And so how do you make it as simple as possible and go no further? And so that's what we began to do after we processed all this, the quant research, and we did scores of interviews and talked to leaders about this topic. And so our next step was, how do we translate all that we've learned?
Mm-hmm. And you've learned a lot. There's 3 things that you believe every leader can do to build a healthy culture. Right before we get into those 3 things, because I know there's a ton of meat there and it's going to be super valuable and tactical for all of us today. Briefly, why does that gap exist? Why do you believe leaders are saying culture is important, but they're not failing to make it a priority like they should? Why is that gap you just talked about such a problem?
There are any number of drivers. If I had to put them in categories, I would say one of them is the quicksand that I wrote about in my last book, Smart Leadership. You've got a lot of men and women who are encumbered by the busyness, the distraction, the complexity, the fear, the fatigue, the aimlessness, maybe even success is encumbering them. It's really hard to lead well. I would argue it's impossible to lead well over time if you're in quicksand. A lot of leaders, it's like, I just can't get to it because they're trying to stay alive. They're trying to survive, as are their teams. So I think that's the one reason. But the other reason, the one we decided to attack in this book, is the topic is so squishy to some. I'd rather reframe it as being very strategic. Peter Drucker said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's the most strategic thing a leader can work on. And again, we can discuss and debate that later if somebody wants to, but it's so complex, it's so squishy. We encountered many leaders that literally said, I don't know what to do. And we said, well, if we can figure out what are the essential few activities that leaders must be involved in and engaged with, we think we could help leaders close that gap. Now, let me tell you one quick story. We weren't sure that was possible because this is complicated, right? We could have a conversation about what are the drivers of culture, and we could probably list 100 things. And I'm not trying to minimize any of that, but that adds to the conundrum that many leaders face. Like, what do I do? There's so many things. There's so many levers. There's so many mechanisms. And we found inspiration from the Navy SEALs. Now, we've been inspired by them before. Pretty much whatever we're going to study, we're going to end up having a conversation with a SEAL because they do a lot of things well.
Indeed.
And when the SEALs, a few years back, when the SEALs were going to document their mantra, they were going to put it in writing. The first thing they listed, are you ready for this? You may know the answer, was shoot, move, and communicate. Shoot, move, and communicate. Now, they would quickly tell you there's a lot more you need to know than that to be a SEAL, but that's the first thing you know. And it enables you to survive to fight another day. And we said, what is the equivalent of shoot, move, and communicate for culture? And so that's how we ended up with our 3 rules.
Oh, that's awesome. Amazing. Hey, let's do a quick check-in with the group. You heard Mark talk about this quicksand and how often that is one of the primary culprits behind why we don't feel like we can get to culture. I'm curious how many here today can relate to that? Just by show of hands in the camera, how many of you feel like, yeah, I've got some quicksand and that's what makes culture so hard? Did that validate something for you? Yeah, okay. So you guys relate to that. Do me a favor, put it into the chat. Maybe we can get Mark's thoughts on some of these. Just a quick sort of like check-in from everyone here. What is that quicksand for you? When Mark uses that analogy, what is quicksand? What is the quicksand in your business and your current leadership that's getting in the way of the focus on culture? Drop some of those into the chat. Let's read some of these out. Staff turnover, lack of manager engagement with their direct reports. Yes. Sideways energy from staff, not staying aligned, staffing shortages, failure to evolve. Quicksand is complacency. It's so easy to drift into it and not see that it's swallowing you whole. All these sound familiar, Mark?
Absolutely. And let me affirm, I mean, I can affirm all of them, but the whole thing implied about drifting into it, I've never met a leader that intentionally went to quicksand.
Of course.
So if you're there or have ever been there, I assume it was an accident. Yeah, I understand all this. So this is obviously important and critical and essential. And it's one of those primary barriers to not only culture, but to leadership effectiveness. That's what that project was about. And I know that's really not what people signed up for today, but I don't want to leave you empty-handed. So I want to offer you, we've created a free assessment. And I think there are 20 or 25 questions, but here's what happens. It actually gives you a prescription. It will help analyze and assess based on your responses. What are some actions you can take today? So if you're interested, it's really simple. You need to text Be Smart with no space, BESMART. Somebody can put that in the chat. Be Smart to 66866. 66866. And it's going to ask for your email. Again, we won't sell your email, but what you can then get are, I don't even know how many questions, 25, 30 questions real quick. And you can then print out a prescription that will actually help you take positive steps. Because when you're in the quicksand, real quick, you only have 3 options. One is you swim in it, which is, I think, the default reaction for most leaders, because we're leaders. And when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and we want to role model the right behaviors, and we just swim. Well, okay. I mean, that demonstrates your valor for a moment. But the one is you'll never do your best work in quicksand. 2, you can't help others get out if you're in it. And 3, it's exhausting and not sustainable. I think a lot of the people who have partaken of the Great Resignation, I mean, there are some lofty and noble reasons, and some people got connected with their higher purpose. And yeah. Some of them participated in the Great Resignation because they were exhausted, because they've been trying to swim in quicksand. So that's your first option. You really don't like that option. The second option is you give up. You just sink. You die. You may not physically die, but your hopes and dreams and aspirations are extinguished in the quicksand. And then the only option that remains is to escape. And that's my hope and prayer for leaders around the world. You would get out of the quicksand so you can work on things like culture. When you're in quicksand, you're only working on survival.
Yes.
And there is a higher level of leadership, and culture is part of that.
Man, it's so true.
Maybe that would help.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly helpful to me. And, I have a very small business. I lead a team of 5 to 6 people on a daily basis. And yet I see the book and your thoughts on culture even impacting a very small team. So this isn't just for massive companies with thousands or tens of thousands of employees. And I think one of the things that you've made most helpful is that you've taken this complicated subject that's often hard to boil down into just actionable steps. And you really have named and discovered 3 things that every leader can do to build a vibrant and dynamic culture. You call them rules. And so let's just take them one at a time. What is the first rule?
All right, I'm gonna one more sidebar.
Okay.
I've already gotten a lot of feedback. The book just came out today, and I've gotten a lot of feedback that people don't like rules. I said, well, hold on. Imagine your favorite sport with no rules. Okay, you probably can't. I mean, think about football. When you think about football with no rules, well, you're thinking about rugby probably if you're thinking about football with no rules. But no, I'm talking no rules. See, rules enable you to play the game well. The other thing rules do is they help you know how to win. And in a lot of endeavors, if you violate the rules, you actually lose. And that's what happens with culture. You disqualify yourself if you don't play by the rules. There are three. The first is to aspire, to share your hopes and dreams for your culture. Now, you may think that's a blinding flash of the obvious. Well, hang on. We met far too many leaders who could not succinctly, clearly represent their hopes and dreams for their culture. And some would say, well, it's in my head or it's in my heart. I said, well, it needs to start there, but you need other people to embrace this to actually help bring it to fruition, right? This has got to cascade throughout the entire organization. That frontline person needs to understand the cultural aspirations so that they can live to make it a reality. So the test, we just shared this information with all of our Chick-fil-A family a couple of weeks ago. We were out in San Diego. And the test I asked those folks to consider is it clear? Is it simple? And is it repeatable? And if it's not clear, simple, and repeatable, you've got some more work to do. Peter Drucker, who I referenced earlier, said if you can't put it on a t-shirt, you don't have it yet. You got to make it. You got to make. Now, you can elaborate and you can write a white paper. You can even write a book about it. But what's the essence of it? What are your hopes and dreams for your culture? You must aspire.
Yeah. Why is that so hard for people?
Okay, probably a lot of reasons. One that I think is very pragmatic is a lot of leaders get tangled up and tripped up in the language around aspire. Because there are a lot of smart people that will define mission, vision, purpose differently. And some of them use a definition for mission, for purpose, and some use a definition for vision, for mission. And I tell leaders, all of those are just mechanisms. They're all tools to help you articulate your hopes and dreams. So pick the one, the two, or the three that you want. Be sure everybody on your team knows how you're using the term and then define it for your organization. But I think that people just get tripped up on it. Do I need this? Do I need that? Do I have to have a mission? What's ethos got to do with it? It's like, no, you've got to sort through that. And you have a lot of tools at your disposal.
Yeah. Yeah. So just a lot of overthinking, it sounds like.
Yeah. And one more. Some leaders don't have confidence that they can actually get there.
Yeah.
And my short answer to that is, I hope it's so big you can't get there by yourself. And I hope you don't have all the answers. You know why you need to go there. I would say let's rally the team to figure out how we get there.
Yes.
But if you're waiting on complete clarity and certainty before you can move, you won't do a lot of moving.
No doubt. No doubt. Okay, I know we could spend an entire full day workshop just on the first one, but there are three, and I want to try to get through all three.
There are three.
What is the second rule?
The second rule is to amplify. And we chose that word intentionally. There's so much noise in the world, is that leaders have the opportunity and the responsibility to get the aspiration above the noise. You and I have to be constantly looking for ways to amplify the aspiration.
Yeah. And I'm assuming this is more than just turning up the volume. What's the difference between amplifying and just yelling it louder?
Yeah, people got to believe that it's credible and that it has staying power. And the first thing they're going to look to are the behaviors of their leaders. People always watch the leader, and they're trying to figure out what's important. They're trying to figure out, are you trustworthy? They're trying to figure out if you care about them. But the trustworthy part often hinges on the degree of alignment between our words and our actions.
Mhm.
And so if we say something's important, we've actually got to walk the talk.
Yeah. Is there a tangible example that comes to mind? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here at Chick-fil-A that serves as an example of how you amplify something in your culture?
Well, yeah, here's a fun example that I use because I think it's very approachable. Is Dan Cathy decades ago? I was trying to figure out how long. Decades ago, we were talking about cleanliness, and
Mhm.
Dan Cathy was picking up trash.
Yeah.
And I've been with him when he picks up trash in a Walmart parking lot, and then I've been
Mhm.
with him when he picks up trash in a McDonald's parking lot.
Mhm.
And guess what we do? We pick up trash because our leader said it and showed us, modeled it. And so that's a very, very tactical, I think, accessible answer or response to your question. If the leader says something important and he or she acts like it's important, people will move towards that behavior. Let me
Yeah.
give you one more. This is not a Chick-fil-A example, but it's perhaps my favorite historical example. I'll do this quickly. Some of you know the story of Alexander the Great, who went on a 10-year campaign to conquer the world, which I guess he launched when he was 22. He was a young man. And 6 to 8 years into that campaign, he had been talking and talking and talking to his men about bravery and courage. And he said, "You'll never die with an arrow in your back because we will never retreat." So he always had the language. But what I didn't tell you is he always led from the front. He was in
Mhm.
the battles.
Mm.
And that probably reached a crescendo in 326, battle with the Malians in modern day Turkey. They're scaling a tower. He gets over first, or gets to the top first. The ladder breaks. His men can't follow him. He jumps into the citadel and is fighting hand to hand with the enemy by himself.
Yeah.
By the time his men get over there, of course, they save him, rescue him. He's been wounded, a near mortal wound. Here's what historians say. Said there is much speculation as to the power and efficacy of his army had he not led from the front. They were not just fighting for their country. They were not just fighting for an idea. They were fighting for him because he was with them.
Yes.
People always watch the leader. And so if you want to amplify an aspiration, you need to be really, really careful on what you're doing with your time and your energy.
Yeah.
People are paying attention. My question to close this is, what are people learning from watching you? Because they're learning something.
They absolutely are. It's a powerful question. And I have experienced your examples firsthand, right? I remember one time at Next, we were in rehearsals day. There's no one, big, huge arena. No one's even in the room yet. I'm hanging out on the front row and I just eaten a Kind bar. I'll never forget this. Dan comes in, we're just catching up. And I had just eaten the Kind granola bar and set it on the chair next to me, the wrapper. And I stand up, we're chit-chatting. And after a 10, 15-minute conversation with Dan, right before he leaves, he just bends over, picks up the wrapper of my Kind bar, wads it up, puts it in his pocket. And to your point, there was no microphone in that moment. There was no video camera. It was not loud, which is what we think of, I think, sometimes when we hear the word amplify. That's the idea of amplification. But goodness gracious, it spoke volumes, right? And it communicated values, and it set a tone and a culture for how I would even conduct myself over those next few days. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
All
maybe
right.
if you're here, put it in the chat. What are you hearing right now that you're like, okay, there's an example of something that I need to get better at amplifying. Maybe it's something really tangible in your business, something you're doing in front of other people on your team or even other leaders within your organization. What's the thing that you need to pay closer attention to or change in your behavior that you can amplify? All right, Mark, I know there's 3 rules. It sounds like those 2 rules might be sufficient, but you disagree. There's a third one here. What is it? Why is it so critical?
Yeah, there's actually a trap here. I, guilty among all of you, as leaders, we love to get stuff done and we love to check stuff off and we like to take the next hill. If we're not really careful, we'll declare victory on culture, and that's the beginning of the end. Because if you have a clear aspiration and you amplify it well, the culture will begin to move toward that aspiration. It will happen, I promise. But if you move into protection mode, let's say we're going to bubble wrap it or shrink wrap it to protect the culture, you'll suffocate it. You'll kill it. It will die, because cultures, when healthy, they're living, breathing organisms, right? So the third rule is to adapt, to always be looking for ways to enhance your culture. You don't ever get to stop. I had a leader call me while we were doing this work. It's kind of random. As I said, I've been getting more and more calls about culture over the last 5 years from people who had no idea we were doing this work. There's a CEO, he called and he said, hey, I want to know if you can install a new culture for us. Well, I was actually a bit concerned by his choice of language. And so I said, well, let's talk about what you mean by install. And he said, well, just come in and meet with my team and tell us what we have to do, because we want our culture to look like yours. And I said, well, I'm glad you admire the Chick-fil-A culture. This happened to be a bank. I don't know if I said that or not. And I said, and there may be some things in our culture that would be helpful and productive in your culture. However, we've been working on our culture for over 50 years. I've been working on it for over 40 years, and we're not finished. He said, what do you mean? I said, you don't ever get to stop. He said, what do you mean? I said, I mean what I said. You got to work on culture forever. And I said, let me know if you want me to come meet with your team and we'll talk about it. And he never called back. It's like, no, he wanted to install something. He wanted to move on. He only wanted to use the first two rules. Mm-hmm. And so it just doesn't work that way. The healthy, vibrant, thriving, high performance cultures, the leaders are always looking for ways to enhance the culture. Now, let me quickly say it. Some of you've read the book. I don't even think I put this in the book. That's the way it always happens. You know this as an author. You write a book and then you talk about it for a couple of years after you write it and you go, oh, I should have put that in the book. I should have put that in the book. Well, and often that comes from questions. And so I had a question just recently. They said, what do you mean by enhance? And I said, okay, well, I think I know what I mean by enhance. I said, so what is your question? And they said, well, that assumes there's a problem. Like you want us to fix something. I said, oh, okay, let me go a little deeper. Because I did talk about one of these three in the book. When you think about enhance, think about three things. One is you want to close critical gaps. In the book, I call those toxins. And if untended, they become maladies and they will kill and destroy your organization.
Yes.
All right. Leaders have to attack the toxins. But maybe you don't have anything at the level of toxicity that it's a clear and present danger. Congratulations. The second type of enhancement is where you purposefully and strategically double down on a strength and say, hey, we're really good at X. What if we put extra energy and extra focus? We might get even better. Well, guess what you just did? You enhanced the culture. You strengthen the culture. The third, which gets no airplay in the circles that I normally live in, is adding new capabilities. It's a different type of enhancement. We did this about 15 years ago when one of our senior leaders said, hey, I think we need to be more innovative. Mm-hmm. Now, stay with me for a second, because we've had innovators forever. Truett invented the Chick-fil-A sandwich, right? So we know innovation, but it has not been part of our culture. It's not been part of our DNA. It's been something that certain people do from time to time. And so that was set as an addition to our culture, a new facet of the aspiration. We began to amplify it. And now we have a much more innovative culture than we did a decade ago. So that's that third type of enhancement of adding new capabilities. So when you think about critical gaps, leveraging strengths, and new capabilities, our belief is that every leader should always be doing one or more of those, which means you're always adapting your culture.
So good. So good. All right. So aspire, amplify, adapt. For those of you who already have your copies of the book, they're right here on page 19. I love this framework. Mark, this is so helpful and so practical. I want to get to people's questions here in just a moment. So, because what I'm hearing, the thread throughout this conversation is that this is not something that you can delegate. Leaders are known for being master delegators. We can't delegate culture. It takes all of us but it also requires us. And so as we start thinking of questions and you guys start dropping those in the chat or raising your virtual hands, just to remind you, if you don't have the book already, you got to pick it up. Most of you here already have a copy of the book, but there's also opportunities to get large stacks of the books into your hands, and there's some cool bonuses with that. And so I want to make sure that you order Culture Rules for your entire team, because this is something that is going to take your entire team. And what's cool, if you look at that middle box there, if you order 11 to 499 books, you get everything that's in that first box. Plus, Mark is going to do a private 60-minute virtual event with you and your team to help you guys get this stuff figured out. And they'll also throw in a gift box worth $75. My favorite, obviously, Mark, so much value in that order of 500 books or more, because not only are you going to get everything that's in those first two boxes, you got an in-person keynote, which you're just getting like the tip of the iceberg today. Imagine if you got the full in-person keynote where you can actually work on this stuff in person, 25 culture rules and action journals to supplement the culture work you'll be doing, and then signed copies of all of Mark's 10 books. And so again, this is his 11th book, but you get signed copies of all 10 of them. This is an incredible value. And thank you to all those who have already ordered. Especially thank you to, I believe it's the 27 people now, Mark, that have already reviewed the book on Amazon. And for those of you who are just like, I need this, I'm still struggling to read, guess what? The audiobook is already available and Mark narrated it. And so whether it's the physical copy or the audiobook, jump into this material, because you can tell how much this is going to transform the organization that you guys are leading. And again, if you haven't shared it on social media, please do that. As soon as I get off this one, I'm going to be holding up my copy, taking a photo with it, raving about some of my greatest takeaways from our conversation here today over on social media. We hope all of you will do the same. And Mark is leading by example here. Mark, you're such an incredible leader. You're just like, let me just set the tone right out of the gate and do a healthy culture. What is this barcode we're looking at here on our screen?
Well, when they said we were going to have a party, have you ever been to a good party that didn't have food or drink? And
Not me.
said, I mean, so how do you do that virtually? I think it was somebody on Becky's team that said, well, let's give them a free drink. And I said, how do we do that? Like, well, let's give them the barcode. And so go get free Starbucks on me.
Yeah. So if you haven't, I see some of you pulling out your phones. If you haven't already pulled out your phone to take a picture of that barcode, now's the time before it goes away. Pull out your phone, snap a picture of that, enjoy a Starbucks beverage on Mark and team. And again, what a cool way to just set a tone here and lead with cool, fun culture. Who knew we could have a fun culture, even over a Zoom meeting, All right, Mark, can we get to some questions from the people?
Let's take some
today?
questions,
cool
and I'll try to talk fast and they can listen fast, and we'll see how many questions we can answer.
Cool. We're going to circle back to some of the questions that have been in the chat, as well as give you guys an opportunity to unmute and ask your questions here in person. Let's start with Bob. Bob raised his virtual hand. Bob, welcome to the event. What is your question for Mark?
Could you talk about implementing culture and moving culture?
We're having a hard time
Bob,
hearing.
I'm
Bob.
sorry, I can't hear you, Bob. I mean, I can hear you, but it sounds like you're on Mars or something.
Yeah. Bob, my advice would be maybe drop out of the meeting, check your audio, and then jump right back on the same Zoom link. I promise we'll circle back to you.
Or
you
Bob,
can put your question into the chat. Yeah, you can put it in the chat. Either way, we'll make sure Mark gets you some insight.
All right.
While we're doing that,
Bob.
Yeah, while we're doing that, I believe is it Sherry or Sherry?
It's Sherry.
Sherry, I love the spelling of your name. Sherry, what's your question for Mark?
Yeah, so we launched new culture behaviors over 2 years ago. And admittedly, a couple of them were very aspirational for us. We're a Midwest company. Minnesota Nice comes to mind, kind of the passive aggressive conversations don't happen when they need to. So one of our behaviors is act boldly. The other one's move with speed and decisiveness. And we're over 2 years in, still struggling with these. And the current culture, we're global. How do you kind of really push against some of those really entrenched kind of self-protective behaviors that keep coming up to get to that aspiration?
Great question.
Okay, Sherry, thank you for that question. And this is a great opportunity for me to say, I love Q&A and I hate Q&A. So please, please, please do not misinterpret the brevity of my response with the magnitude of your question. And that will apply to every other question, because I know you people aren't asking the easy questions. You've already figured those things out. So we may in fact have to talk online. By the way, let me do this. All of you, let me give you my phone number. It's 678-612-8441. And I do that for a couple reasons. We're not going to get to everybody's questions, but I want you to still have access to me. And Sherry, this answer will probably be insufficient. And so you'll want to call me and say, tell me more. I would hope you would. Okay. First of all, you mentioned that some of your values and behaviors were aspirational. Let me affirm you and say all values are aspirational. All that, because we're humans, and so every value requires our best, and we're only going to be able to do what we can do, right? And so I have long since tried to stop debating which are aspirational and which are not. They're all aspirational. Some may be more of a stretch.
Yeah.
Here's what I would say about that. I think if they're a huge stretch, you have to own that, and you have to name that. And you say, this one is hard for us. And if you know why it's hard, that you name that too. Mm-hmm. But the fact you're 2 years in, I think, is a great compliment to you and your other leaders. What typically happens is when you hit something that's hard or it's not getting traction, somebody wants to rewrite the values again. And I'm assuming you put a lot of thought and a lot of time and a lot of energy in coming up with the ones that you have. Again, I can only offer two things. I'd love to talk to you for an hour about this. One is, I think you've got to keep, I'm assuming you're doing this, there has to be a lot of education. It's like, not only what does it mean behaviorally, what's out of bounds, what's in bounds, the why behind it. You didn't make this up for a reason. And I think people have to understand. So a tremendous amount of education, particularly on the hard stuff. Yeah. And then leaders have to model it. We already talked about it. But another huge way to move these values forward is with storytelling. And so I don't know how much of that you're doing, but Harris is an expert on story. He may want to throw something in here. Those were the top two ways that we found to amplify a culture from all of our work, was the behavior of the leader and the stories that you tell. And so I just want to encourage you to stay on it, because you'll need to stay on it forever. Yeah. Because every new person has to learn, adopt, embrace, and activate those values. And so you got to do this over and over and over, forever and ever. Harris, what would you say about the power of story? I'll give you a moment.
Oh man, I think you covered it. I would just add that, remember that stories, you said the stories that we tell, and that everything is story. And so even that example of picking up trash, there may not be an exchange of words, but that action still speaks volumes. That tells the story. And so stories are in and through everything. Mark, I think it's great advice. Yeah, well done.
Yeah. So good luck, Sherry. If you want to keep talking, we can do that offline.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sherry. Hey, circling back to Bob, Mark, he had a great question. His question in the chat was how, and I would imagine you get this question a lot, how much of successfully implementing these three rules that you talked about are top down versus bottom up? How do you involve your people in creating the culture that you want?
It is both top down and bottom up if you are to be successful. But the leader initiates. The leader sets the pace. The leader is the architect. The leader is the designer. And maybe I should even say leaders, but it typically emanates from a leader. Now, if you're nested within an organization, then you are that leader. And then what you're trying to create are micro cultures that support the whole. The trick is you don't want to allow countercultures to emerge. Those are cultures that are working against the larger stated goals, objectives, priorities, and aspiration of the organization. But you will have microcultures. Accounting is going to have a different culture than marketing or operations or the human resources department, and that's fine as long as they're not counter to. And so in all of those examples, the point leader of that group is the leader. that's setting an aspiration, that's amplifying, and that they're adapting. So it's top down and bottom up, but it starts with leaders.
Yes.
I mean, because
Yes.
ultimately, alignment is one of the measures of how strong, healthy, and vital is your culture. And by alignment, it's how many people share the aspiration and are working towards it. And so, again, by our definition of a high performance culture, alignment is the first test. So you ultimately have to get everybody.
Yep. And alignment comes back to storytelling. That's what we're really doing, is aligning on the narrative. It's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Thanks, Bob, for the great question. Jonathan, welcome. What's your question for Mark?
Not just for the opportunity to speak, but also for asking Bob's question first, because I actually have a follow-up. That is my question. So for context, I've been working at my company for the past 5 years or so, and I'm the culture champion on my team. So while I'm not an official manager, I don't have direct reports, I've been spending a lot of my time, especially in the past year and a half, providing opportunities for advocacy and recognition for a bunch of my peers. And I know that my company has really great, they call them success drivers. It's our core competencies. And one of the things that I've been gleaning from getting a chance to read the book beforehand and listening to this call is trying to decipher the difference between preaching the values versus practicing the values. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on where someone like me and my role within the company on how I can help amplify and adapt to the culture at my level.
Okay. Jonathan, thank you. Great question. I think it's both. I think you got to preach and practice. Now, if there's conflict, people will disregard what you're preaching. They will overvalue the practice. But here's why you do both, because people may see your behaviors, but they might interpret them differently. So by preaching it, you give language for people to connect your behaviors to. And I would even argue that you can be very explicit and say, because of our value X, I'm going to do Y. And so you help people connect those dots between word and deed. So I think it's both. At the end of the day, though, you probably need to be more careful with what you do, because it will, as I've tried to explain, it will nullify what you've said if it's not in alignment. And then the unintended consequence of that is you begin to erode your own leadership. And over time, you will lose all fellowship because people will deem you untrustworthy. Yep. Yeah. Preach it and practice it.
So good. So good. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate the question, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Mark, there was another question in the chat that's kind of related to this. You know, we're talking a lot about top down versus bottom up right now. And there's a question from Mark about how do employees who are really desperate for a stronger culture, how do they lead from the bottom? How do they get their leaders to see the need for change when it comes to culture? Any thoughts on that?
Wow, that's a huge question for 12:53 Eastern time. Let me think about that for just a second. That's a big question.
I know we're not going to fully answer it. Where would you maybe start? Let's try to zero it down into like,
okay, yeah, I'm thank you for helping me. I think you start at the micro culture level. Start with your team or your department or your division. Now, maybe you're not even the leader, but you may have more influence than you give yourself credit as you think about your team or your part of the organization. And I've always given this advice to people. People always want to ask me about career advice. And, you know, I'm not an expert. I have had a career, but here's my default response. Always work to make your boss wildly successful. And if you will help your boss enhance the culture of your team, your department, or your division, that's good for your boss. That's ultimately good for you. And it's good for that culture. So I would say start close to home. I mean, you might want to go after the CEO and the executive committee, and depending on where you sit, that might be appropriate. But if you're a frontline contributor, that may be a step too far right now. But if your team begins to thrive and your team has lower turnover and higher productivity and whatever metrics, if your team is thriving, maybe one of those senior leaders is going to come and say, tell me what's going on. And you can say, well, let me tell you about our culture. So start close to home.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Ready for one more rapid fire?
Okay. I might have two, but go ahead.
So John asked a question.
Because I saw one. I wanted to answer. It just went flying by. I'm trying to stay focused and I'm not really reading all the questions, but It was the question about, are there supplemental resources?
Okay, go for it.
Because there were for previous book. The answer is yes. Field guide, quick start guide, journals. So leadeveryday.com. I just didn't want people to not know there are supplemental resources. Okay. What's your last question?
Well, there's a question from John about how does a leader's humility play into a high performance culture? And then kind of the follow-up from that from Dan was, what's a healthy definition of humility to go by? Because there's a wide variety of what leaders think about that. And so maybe just give us a brief, short final thought, the role of humility in this, and what is humility to you?
Well, it's interesting. I'm working on another project right now. It's fun because I tend to swim in the leadership lane, how so many of these things are interconnected and even interdependent. And we're actually talking about the biggest barriers and challenges to effective leadership, because what we're talking about today requires an effective leader. Like, this is hard. So the number one barrier that we're still doing this work. We just did a global survey. I can report more in 6 months, but it looks like the number one barrier to effective leadership is ego, which is the absence of humility. And I love the quote. It's attributed to many people. I think it may be Abraham Lincoln. He's a safe one to say. Abe says that the best leaders don't think less of themselves. They just think of themselves less often.
Yeah.
It's like, we believe that one of the character traits that differentiates the best leaders is the cultivated ability to think others first. If you can think others first, there's virtually no limit to the impact you can have as a leader.
Well said. Well said. Hey, I want to put up that slide one more time from the team as we close out in here. And then Mark, I want to give you the final word. While we're doing this, one of the ways to show and just kind of affirm for Mark what was most helpful to you is to put it into the chat. As you kind of come out of today's experience, what's been most helpful to you? What's been most valuable? That's a valuable exercise for you. Instead of just jumping out of this and going on to the next thing, letting this go in one ear, not the other. What is it that you need to write down? What is it that you need to take out of this into the next thing? What's been most helpful? What's been most valuable to you? Drop an idea, craft a little sentence, drop an idea into the chat. That'd be super helpful. And just to remind you, the free bonuses associated with this, they end March 20th. So you got to claim those bonuses. You heard Mark say it earlier, leadeveryday.com. Leave those reviews on Amazon. Thanks to the folks who already have. Make sure you get those bulk orders in, because these are incredible bonuses. I've watched Mark from afar for a long time. He shows up big in this way, and this book truly is special. So I hope you guys will pick up a copy. And don't forget to grab that Starbucks beverage on him. Mark, we got a couple minutes left. You got a lot of leaders here that represent thousands of leaders. And because of the ripple effect that culture can have, we're talking potentially millions of people, so much influence here on this call. What would your final word of encouragement, inspiration, wisdom be to all the folks who have joined us here today?
Well, thank you, Harris, for being with us today. Becky, thank you for pulling this together. Here's my final thought. And those of you that have been on my webinars, or those that were at the Chick-fil-A event, I'm going to tell you a story that I've already told you. And I'm going to tell you again, not because I'm losing my mind, but because I believe in the concept of strategic repetition. I may be losing my mind. That's another story. But I believe in strategic repetition. Truett Cathy told us every year for 10 years at our annual meeting that when someone says thank you, we say my pleasure. And it wasn't because he lost his mind. It was strategic repetition. And so I'm going to share an idea with you that many of you have heard. I'm going to do it quickly. You may be familiar with the movie, the Steven Spielberg film, Ready Player One, or the Ernest Cline novel by the same name. So if you don't know the story, if you do, stay with me because you need to hear this again. The story is fascinating. I'm not going to give you the story arc here, but the story unfolds in two worlds, in the real world and an online world called the Oasis. And the hero of the story, his name is Wade Watson in the real world. When commenting on the oasis, he says this. He said, people go to the oasis for what they can do there. And they stay because of who they can become.
Mm.
Now, it's not my place to set the aspiration for your culture, but I have an aspiration for your culture. I would love for you to create a culture that is so life-giving, so soul enriching that people are attracted there because of what they can do. They can actually get a job. But what I would love for them to discover after they join your organization is that your place, it's real. And it will enable them to become someone that they could never have become outside your organization. You can do this, but you can never stop. Culture rules work. Aspire, amplify, and adapt, but never stop. And you will build a life-giving, soul-enriching, high-performance culture. And if I can serve you along the way, you know how to reach me. Thanks for joining us today.
So good. So good. All right. Again, the book, Culture Rules. Mark, you rule, my friend. Hey, I know these coming out of a Zoom meeting, it feels like just typing emojis into the chat doesn't feel sufficient. I'm going to take the risk here and put everyone on the spot. I want everyone to find your mute button. It's